Hello there folks, I'm Dan Brown from Sort of Interesting. I've spent most of my adult life living on canal boats, and today I would like to talk about the dangers of narrowboat life. Now, that might sound like it's a comedy overreaction or clickbait, but when you think about that rural ideal of a slow-paced life in the countryside, you've also got to think that you're envisioning a life on a steel tube out in hard-to-access places, often very secluded, also on the water, and of course a significant amount of time through all seasons and weather conditions. So there's a little bit more to think about here than may first meet the eye. I've always lived on simpler and older boats without a lot of fancy gadgets or wiring and things like that on board, so I've always viewed safety as more of a concern for being out and about and around the boat rather than being on the boat. But of course there is one potential huge safety flashpoint on a lot of the boats out on the canals, and that is if you've got a wood and coal burning stove on board. Firstly, you've got the standard worries of that sort of thing, of the potential for smoke leaking and carbon monoxide, and of course the general fire hazard of something that you're literally putting burning things in and that is becoming burning hot. But on a boat, you've also got the fact you're very enclosed with that, so you've got far less space for that carbon monoxide and smoke to leak out and dissipate into if that is an issue, which of course you want to get solved straight away. So you might want 1 or 2 smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms on board. Obviously your fire extinguishers, classic safety equipment is a given, but there's also the fact that sometimes, and I found this to myself with a simple lapse of concentration many years ago on my first boat, the cramped area can lead to unexpected and just simple mistakes really. So I'd got my fire lit, it was all burning nicely and the boat was really warm and lovely, and foolishly, just out of just pure idle sort of thoughts, I picked up my coal bucket and put it next to the fire. And of course, that fire was throwing out so much heat that after a while I started to think, oh, I can smell the fire really strong, what's going on there? And when I had a look, it had actually started to warm up the coal that was in the bucket, and the coal itself that wasn't even in the fire had started to warm and smoke and of course give off all those horrible fumes straight into the cabin. That was a mistake I did not repeat. Equally, the small space as you're brushing past, going up and down the corridor, it's easy to knock things off the surface, it's easy to catch your leg and burn yourself. These are little things that sometimes you find just happen because of that constant life around the fire in close proximity. The first issue you've got to think about when you're outside of the boat is the most obvious. You are living constantly around water. Now, a lot of people will go, well, the canals are only shallow, you could stand up and you're not going to drown and all that sort of stuff. And that's exactly the sort of thinking that can lead to disaster. It might be true that a lot of the canals are very shallow and I could stand up and maybe only be between waist and chest high in them. However, when it comes to actually getting yourself out of the canal, depending on how fit you are and what's going on and the temperature of the water even, you can have first of all had that complete shock to your system of unexpectedly falling into freezing cold water, but then when you get over to the towpath to haul yourself out, you might find that suddenly between the wet grass, the sheer side of the canal and all of your wet clothes and body, it's not quite so simple to drag yourself up to safety as you might think. And this is something that I've seen firsthand, and I had a bit of a Baywatch David Hasselhoff hero moment in front of my girlfriend. It wasn't that dramatic, I wasn't a hero. Oh. But me and my girlfriend were walking back to the car from the boat one day, and we saw a set of holiday boaters and a woman fell off the back of the boat. So her son was on the side of the canal on the towpath, her husband was steering the boat, and she fell in. So she comfortably got across to the side to where her son was on the towpath, but between them there was a significant struggle to haul her up out of the canal water. This was during the winter time as well, so she had proper thick coat and trousers and proper boots and stuff on, so she had the most waterloggable clothes to make it as difficult as possible. So I gave my girlfriend my backpack and I ran down the canal towpath, and together we managed to, the three of us, heave her up and out of the water. But again, it's one of those moments where if she'd have been on her own as a solo boater and that had happened, the situation could have been annoying at first and, oh, I've fallen in the water, I can't believe it. But it would be very easy to panic in the immediate moments when you get over to that towpath, reach up and realise you can't drag yourself up and out. Another area of concern is, of course, travelling through locks. Now, you might immediately think about boats being sunk in locks and see images popping up online during the summer holidays of boats that have sunk. Either they've been pinched in by walls that have warped, and then as the water's risen or fallen, the boat's stuck in place around a pivot point pinched in by the walls, or the leaky lock gates could have poured water into the front or back of the boat faster than anybody could respond to the disaster unfolding. But there's of course the human potential cost and danger here, not of people being on the boat when it sinks, although that is of course a potential issue, but more of the walking around, going from pillar to post, keeping a tab on the boat as you're working the lock itself. And it's incredibly easy to have a lapse of concentration, especially if you've been out boating for hours on end and you're starting to look forward to the end of the day when you tie the ropes and get off to bed to sleep. So there's a couple of potential things here. Firstly, it's getting yourself or your limbs trapped between the boat and the sides of the lock. It's something that can happen a lot easier than you think because you're working with very limited space in a lot of the narrow locks on the narrow gauge canals. However, I would also say this is something that isn't very often thought about, but because one end of the locks and the lock gates that you have to physically push and pull open and close are often, well, almost universally raised up on one side. Could be a 10-foot drop, could be a 2-foot drop, could be a bigger drop. And I know for a fact that at the Frankton locks there was a very serious incident where somebody was opening the bottom locks, and of course you've potentially got very wet ground, you've potentially got any number of surfaces that could be slippy, could be wet grass, could be oily, anything could be happening. And as you're pushing that gate open, you're literally coming up to a sheer drop. And so unfortunately, I believe it was a woman, fell straight over that drop and I think had to be airlifted in that case to the hospital, because again, we're talking about being in these remote and harder to access, awkward rural places. And so what happened after that was the Canal and River Trust came down and they put like a right angle metal bar on the end of the lock gate, so that as you were pushing the lock gate open, instead of having a sheer drop there, there's a built-in barrier that you have moving with you to stop you slipping and falling over that drop. So there's more going on at locks in terms of safety and potential danger than you might immediately think. The final topic that I'm going to talk about here, unfortunately, is idiots and vandals and weirdos on the towpath. Now, this is something that starts to lean into the varied nature of the canal a little bit more, where obviously the canals across the country go through city centres, they go through unbelievably rural locations, so there's not one complete defined experience that you're likely to have when it comes to gangs and trouble and, as I say, any number of unsavoury characters who might be out and about. You'll find in general, but not exclusively, a lot of the trouble will be more around the urban centres that the canals pass through, because of course if you're right next to a city or a town, there's a lot more people who might not be the best of characters with a lot easier access to get out to the canals and boats themselves. So because of the nature of me either being in a marina or mooring up in very remote rural areas, I haven't had too many issues. However, when I was moored up at Ellesmere, a really popular place filled with friendly boaters keeping an eye on things all around, I went away on holiday for a week, and when I returned, I was not particularly happy or comfortable to see that where the spiders had moved on and started to weave their webs around the back of the boat, all of the cobwebs around the lock on the door latch had been broken. So that suggested to me that in the previous 24, maybe 36 hours, somebody had stood on the back of my boat, physically testing the lock to see if they could get inside. So of course, that's something that you've got to be sensible and got to be aware of. Make sure that you can lock the boat from the inside. Don't be complacent thinking you're so remote that trouble won't find you, because you never know who's on other boats, never mind people walking up and down the towpath. There's incidents that have happened in the local area to where I am now, where the police had to knock on boat doors downstream because there was, believe it or not, a canal boat based police chase going on where somebody was refusing to come over to the side. So the police ran ahead, alerted the local boaters and people moored up that there was trouble coming, and they just walked down the side of the boat, the side of the canal, as the boat moved down the water until they could apprehend them. And that's something that's important to remember and important to think about. There's simple things like keeping your doors locked and checking in with people on a regular basis that you would do whether you were anywhere living, whether you're on holiday, living in a town, living on a boat, making sure that people know where you are, especially if you're travelling through unfamiliar and more remote areas, whether that's friends or family that you message every now and then or a couple of times a day to check in, or whether that's local boaters that you meet who might also have some advice to tell you about potential trouble or characters and where you want to be or where you don't want to be. There's unfortunately not much that you can do ultimately. We know what the world's like today, and unfortunately you always have to have that slight bit of suspicion and I suppose an air of caution when choosing where you're going to moor up. And I myself have been a towpath walker and cyclist in the small hours of the night, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, there's probably people who I've given the shivers to as I've walked past their boat with my torch in maybe between 11 and 2 a.m. for argument's sake. And this is something that is just part of life, unfortunately. So having said all of that, it's of course important for me to end this with a slightly more positive note, where I say in all of my years of boating, I've had so few problems that I myself get complacent and overlook and don't think about these things until there are little moments where I nearly get me hand crushed between the boat and the towpath, or see somebody in the small hours wandering the towpath and think, now I don't feel quite so clever and serene and comfortable out here. And so of course, I would say boat life is tremendous. It can be fantastic. It's definitely not for everyone, but do your research before you buy a boat and see where life takes you. Thank you so much for tuning in, my friends. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please consider checking out my short books about boat life, available as a paperback and as Kindle books. If you want to help me out, please consider checking out the Patreon page. Links in the description, where you'll find bonus little podcast episodes and video clips and loads of free stuff too. So you don't even have to pay to see a lot of what I put up on Patreon. Until the next time, my friends, I'll leave you with all the links in the description to find me all over the internet. I'll say thank you very much for watching once again, and until the next time, keep it boat worthy, keep it interesting, have a fantastic day, and of course, farewell.